If you knew you were going to be magically transported to a D&D style fantasy universe and you could only bring 5 items with you, what 5 items would you bring? Greetings, adventurers. My name is Kramer. You've heard of Living History. This is Living Anachronism, where we attempt to discover the history of a world that never existed. And a viewer of mine, Artemis Winchester, said that her husband was going to be running a self-insert D&D game. And to me, that means that you, or me, with only the skills that you actually possess, would be transported into this D&D world, and they were allowed to bring 5 items. And I thought to myself, wow, that is actually a really interesting thought experiment. But in order for this to be not just fun, but also a useful tool, this thought experiment, this hypothetical, we first need to lay some ground rules so that we are all going off the same page. So the first rule that I'm going to self-impose is something modern, something that would fit in our time period, but would not fit in the fantasy medieval period, something like your phone or like a lighter, anything like that I will consider cheating. The next thing is anything that exists in a fantasy medieval world but does not exist in our world. For instance, you could not walk into a fantasy medieval world with like a health potion. That I will also consider cheating. And the third rule is simply that anything that exists in both of our worlds and is technically achievable, but is also not really feasible, is also going to be considered cheating. That is like entering this new world with a catapult or a ballista or something like that. Technically, you could make one in real life or purchase one in real life, and technically, yes, those would exist in a fantasy medieval period, but to enter into a world with something like that, with the main goal of just having this astronomical advantage, is obviously not in the spirit of the game. Lastly, I'm going to assume that clothing, basic things that all people would have in this new world, are going to be quote-unquote included. So that is a basic set of clothing. A cloak I'm going to include in that because most people would have one, and one single belt pouch. Anything after that I'm considering to be an extra item, but those are very, very basic things. And if we were to say that those counted as the 5 items, then all of a sudden you don't have any items left because you have shirt, pants, shoes, pouch, cloak, that's it. Obviously that is not what is intended. Now, my list is not exhaustive, and I'm not even necessarily saying that my list is the correct one, so I fully expect to see other people with their lists of 5 items down in the description. And ideally, if you can put explanations as to why you're bringing those things, maybe I might be convinced one way or another. And given that this is a fantasy world and not a game like Valheim, I'm also going to assume that some form of civilization, whether it's a town or a village, is going to be available within roughly 3 days worth of time upon entering this new world. So let's start with number 1. The first thing that I'm going to bring, and I'm actually wearing it right now, is a camp axe. And you will notice that I'm not wearing a sword. And that is because this has more utility. Yes, it can be a weapon, but mostly it is going to allow you to do a lot of things in order to survive around camp. That is preparing firewood, that is creating a shelter of some sort, if that's something that you need to do. But this is just a more versatile option for me than either a sword or a knife. At least the way I'm interpreting it right now is that a lot of the things you would need a knife for, you can technically do with an axe. It's, again, not optimal, but when we're limited to 5 things, this is obviously a better weapon than just a knife is. You can cut your food with it, you can do a basic amount of whittling with it, and there are things that you can do with a knife, like process firewood, that an axe will simply be more efficient at. And so for that reason, I'm choosing an axe as my first item to bring into this fantasy world. The second item I am wearing on my back, and that is my bow. And you might be saying, well, why wouldn't you bring a war bow? 2 answers. 1, I don't actually have one at the moment. And 2, I think you should really be bringing something that you're already comfortable with. I don't have any experience with a full 100-pound, 120-pound war bow, but I know that I can use this little bow effectively, and I know that it's going to be enough in order for me to do what I need it to do, which is allow me to kill small game, like squirrels or rabbits or whatever magical creature there happens to be, so that I have food when I'm entering this new area, and something that I can potentially sell later down the road if I'm catching various game here. I'm not good at making traps. Trapping is not a skill that I physically possess at this moment, so the bow is the way that I'm going to go with that. It is also a decent weapon when we're talking about self-defense. It also prevents me from having to come up close to an enemy. If we're talking about you or me just suddenly getting transported into this fantasy universe, I train, right? I know how to use a long sword, but I'm not going to be as good as people or other creatures that have grown up in this place and have been doing this like in order to survive. Even if I could bring a sword, I'm not going to be just rushing to go and like fight and prove myself, because I will probably die very, very quickly unless I find someone to teach me. And so a bow is going to help mitigate that problem a little bit. I don't have to get into a melee. If I need to get out of a hairy situation, I have a bow that is going to be useful enough, and in the meantime, it can fulfill the purpose of allowing me to hopefully survive. So the third thing, and maybe it should have even been the first thing, is I choose to bring a bottle of water, something that I can carry with me so I'm not dependent on finding a source of water the second that I get in there. Water, very important, keeps you alive. You can only go 3 days without water, and that's without strenuous activity like running around and foraging and surviving. So I think this is absolutely a must-have. I was a little uncertain whether like a bottle of water and a couple days worth of rations would automatically be included, but this is all hypothetical anyway, so I think having a bottle of water is very important. Number 4 on my list is some rope, preferably real elvish rope if you can get it, but some rope or some cordage, something like that. This is a insanely useful material to have while you are out trying to survive or something. It will allow you to make a backpack. It will allow you to create a shelter. It will allow you to do so many things just with rope. And if you know how to trap, you obviously are gonna want some rope for that, for a lot of different traps that are out there. It is also a great fire starter if you're using something natural, some sort of natural cordage like hemp or something like that. You can light that on fire and then build a fire from that with the wood that you've collected with your camp axe. So a highly versatile item right there. And I say you can use this to make a backpack because, in my opinion, a backpack would be considered an item. I said you get one pouch because most people would have one pouch to carry their things. Anything other than that is an accessory, it is an extra item, but with some rope, you can get 3 sticks, tie them together into a frame pack, and that will allow you to carry your things, either with your cloak or with your coat or something like that. You can make a backpack with just rope if you bring it. And the last thing, and this is kind of why I thought this experiment was a really good thing to do. The last thing I don't actually have at the moment, which means I need to get my hands on it, and that is an oilcloth tarp, preferably between 7 and 9 by 9 feet. If you're not familiar, when I say oilcloth, I mean one type of waterproofed linen or cotton sheet, essentially, and that can be used for a lot of things. It can be used as part of your frame pack. It can be used to make a shelter. It can be worn as a water-resistant layer. It can be used as the shell of a sleeping bag in order to keep you warm at night if it happens to be damp on the ground, and it can also be cut up in the very worst case scenario if you need to make other things like bags or pouches, though I wouldn't recommend that because then you don't have your main source of shelter. And this is how this little thought experiment is helpful, because it helps you boil down what you think the most necessary things are for you. And then in my case, and maybe your case as well, you find that something that you think you really need, something that is highly versatile, something that you'd really want to bring with you, you don't actually have yet. And that can help you identify what your next project should be, what your next purchase should be. And while obviously only having 5 items isn't optimal, it does help you identify what the most important things to you are. So now onto the honorable mentions, because I know some people are gonna say this one, it should have been number 1 and should be included in everyone's list. And I went sort of back and forth on this one, and that is some sort of fire starting kit, whether that's Flint and Steel or some sort of wood turning fire kit, something in order to actually get the fire going. And yes, that is absolutely very important. Here is why I decided I could actually spare it in order to get 5 other items. The first one is that if you have an axe that is wrought iron, you can use it as a striker. All you need to do is find flint. If you know where flint usually can be found, along stream beds, something like that, you can not have a dedicated fire kit to begin with. And if you have arrows, like I have a couple back here that actually have flint heads or some other sharp stone heads that you know will strike off of steel, again, that's why I'm not including a fire kit in my personal top 5 at this moment. Similar to a knife, if a knife is in your kit and your knife is made out of steel or wrought iron, you can probably also use that to strike, something good to test before you go out into the woods and realize you don't have a way to start a fire. But there are tools and ways to get around not having a dedicated flint and steel. But if, for instance, the water bottle is actually like included in this hypothetical teleport and I have a spot freed up, I would bring something like this. This is a small fire steel. You can strike on the end of it, and it also has a knife point right on the end. So that is a 2-in-1 right there. And I don't consider that cheating. Having one item that's purpose is to do multiple different things, but would still exist in the time period, this is not cheating, that is just smart. Another honorable mention, something that you could technically fabricate out in the wild with a nice sturdy stick or with a large thorn, is a brooch like this. This is useful for keeping your garments attached to you, but if you have a nice large one like this, the point can also be used as an awl when it comes to repairing leather, such as your shoes, or adding holes to your garments if you need to lace an extra thing, or it can be used as a pricker if you need some sort of fork because you don't want to just eat with your hands. This is not just for fastening your garments, it is also a useful tool. I don't think it's useful enough or urgent enough that I would take up one of the 5 items worth of space with this, but it is definitely something to consider. I also heavily considered bringing a noggin. I have a very recent video on what a noggin is, or some other small sort of personal cup or bowl, something that would make it easier to eat with or collect water with, but I think the bottle kind of fills the water needs, and for a little while, just eating out of your hands is okay. You can also carve a plate out of a log, something like that. It is, again, a not optimal option, but a fixable option that I don't think requires having that right when you enter the world. And the last honorable mention, something I heavily considered but ultimately opted against, was some sort of personal sized cooking pot, whether that is a clay pipkin or a steel or copper pot, something to bring with you. Now, I think that's very useful, and I think you should get one upon entering this new world as soon as possible. Definitely a useful adventuring tool for boiling water, either just to purify it or later to cook with or something like that, and then it also doubles as a personal eating vessel. But again, I think you can get by without it, because if you're planning on hunting, you don't necessarily need to make a stew. You can just roast the rabbit right over the fire like that. So while it is useful, while it is a good quality of life improvement, it's also not really going to be the difference between like life or death in the first couple hours of entering this new world. If for some reason you're looking for ways to open up space, I also think that while the oilcloth tarp is something that I personally would want to bring, it is technically replaceable if you have a good cloak. A wool cloak like this, or an oilcloth or waxed linen cloak, can technically be used for pretty much the same purpose. It can help make a backpack, it can help be a shelter, and you can also use it as part of your bedroll. The only difference is that if you're relying on this to be your shelter, it also then cannot be your blanket at the same time. So having both in order to get through the night is more optimal than just relying on one. So let me know what you think down in the comments below. If you agree with my list, if you would choose different items, and let us know what your top 5 items would be and why. I will see you very soon, and in the meantime, I'd like to wish you good luck on your adventures.